Good day, my dear friends. 333 Our troops of Alexander the Great, who won in Asia Minor, are moving the automobile industry to the left of the mountains to the river, and two questions occupy people in relation to Alexander the Great. Was he a great commander, or did he just use the inheritance of Philip I of his father? And to how did he manage to do all this in 10 years to conquer half of Asia? And these are my friends, Savramatov with you. Let's get together in the 3rd century BC, even in the year 4333. The space of Asia Minor is the army of the young. The Macedonian king is moving towards the Mediterranean coast in front of the Cilician Mountains. And then there is a narrow valley near the city of Issus, where the first general battle between the Macedonians and the Persian king Darius will take place. 1 hour of the today videos just devoted to his military leadership art. And the second is my deep conviction that as promoter Alexander the Great was not less great than as the leader, and propaganda has played in his conquest is not smaller, maybe even bigger role than it military victory. Let's start with the first question. As the saying goes, real goddess learn to walk, and this great commander you can see, because he's winning they only someone with whom he has to fight, although I do not argue to downplay the military, the power of the Persians. But still, of course, the Persian army is not the Roman legions, so how would it was easier for Alexander to defeat the Persians than Hannibal the Romans? But at the same time, Alexander was always considered more than a great general Hannibal. Why so? Let's look at how small the drops of water in the nature of ongoing Alexander military operations reflected its huge military genius, who was jealous of all the ancient generals, including Hannibal and Caesar, as well as follow-up to Napoleon Bonaparte's right advice. Boys make life with whom to study and do her from Alexander the Great, because the study of the campaigns of Alexander the other prison he set straight to the task students in the 7 series. In the future school French generals, but in general, in short, the tradition of military that existed until the 19th century, when Alexander wintered Asia Minor, pre-release of young soldiers to their wives and children born in Macedonia, and getting them back in the spring, happy, joyful worship, which is collected and brought to him a petal they and the son of a log. He moved out of town, the city where in great Phrygia stood the camps, his troops to the heights of separating the different region of Asia Minor from the coastal town in Cilicia, forcing the brand. The task itself is not trivial, especially when you consider that the only road between Phrygia and Cilicia took through the so-called Cilician Gate, an extremely narrow mountainous gorge that even pack cattle had to jump, and unlearn once to lead them through a passage several paces wide that could protect a couple dozen warriors from an entire army. When the campaign began, Alexander left the army under commanded by Parmenion, and himself with Hippolytus and cavalry rushed forward, covered 62 miles in 2 days, and rapidly approached the Cilician Gate. The satrap of Cilicia, or himself, who was preparing to defend the pass, was caught off guard and did not expect such speed from Macedonian, abandoned the gate guards and rode away, leaving his province, his satrapy, unprotected. Alexander captured the pass, demonstrating how important in the mountain war the impetuosity of his actions, the surprise and force of his blow increased many times over, and the words flew in front of the hooves of his hetaires, causing panic to the Persians and paralyzing their will to resist. Where possible, the Macedonian army stopped at this time. The Persian king was gathering his troops on the wide plains of northern Syria, to the west of present-day Aleppo, and there he gathered large forces from all sides of his empire, personally leading the army. His army included numerous Greek mercenaries, as well as Leipzig, Babylonian, Armenian infantry, mountain peoples, horsemen, numerous different Arabs, and others. In short, the number of it is absolutely impossible to determine his troops. Historians have been arguing about this since the time of Clint Turkey Rufus and Ariana, who said that the Persians had thousands, not 600,000 of infantry, and all sorts of nonsense. In the middle of the 20th century, it was believed that the Persians had 120,000 soldiers of Alexander about 40,000 fighters. But today, historians tend to reduce the number of Persian troops by a few more, about 60 to 80,000 fighters, which in itself was, of course, a tremendous amount of strength if we teach that about 9 to 12,000 Russian soldiers and 15 to 16,000 Horde soldiers of the 14th century AD converged on the Kulikovo field. It has been almost 2 years. Don't look at the difference in the military capabilities of states. But just like that, military history did not follow a direct path, not Nevsky Prospect. From simple to complex, from literary history did not follow a direct path, not Nevsky Prospect. From simple to complex, from lesser. Deploy your troops slowly approaching the Persian location. I must say that Darius apparently feared Alexander because despite its rapid offensive action, by numerical superiority, he took up a defensive position to cover stream and orders him to hammer in stakes and to fill the palisade behind which and covered their shooters, archers, and cardo to the Persian warriors, armed and trained in the Greek sample called Persian hoplites, who in this battle for the first time as opposed powerful connection of the Greek Macedonian troops, but looking ahead to say, that generally does not show in addition on the high bank right bank Pinara, became the Greek hoplites near the sea on a comfortable wide plain, where the stream gets where it right steep bank. Passes this to log lowland Persian placed numerous great armed heavy cavalry, and his left flank of the Persians held numerous infantry forces, who climbed the cliffs and rocks of the romance of the mountains and was threatened their hanging on approaching Asmimaki. Then Alexander immediately realized that the Persians were ready to fight from defense, and used this time against Darius because the distributed his troops blocked the attack with his own fortifications means that will stand and wait until attack the Macedonians, and he slowly began to deploy its troops, leaving from plains and gradually from the column in. Building a long battle the line, he himself led the right flank with the cavalry on the left. He stood Parmenion with Thessalian cavalry first. Not an expert, I'm just a small groups here, and in the center was the Macedonian phalanx. And it all began slowly shore and the power fighters weary the return march to move to the Persian location, quickly noticing that Persian arrows on the left flank created dangerous threat to the environment. Alexander decided to use the passive combat order of the Persians in order to neutralize left cross. He threw their shooters agree on unmatched Macedonian mountain special forces of the barbarian tribe in Upper Macedonia, which were good climb the mountains, and they used specializers in the army of Makeda. Not she was in such from mountain battles and strengthened their 3 bodies, that is, 3 of which are cavalry, and he continued his army to slowly move forward. At this time his here thus formed right flank shock troops rushed to the Persian shooters, which once on the rocks of the mountain slopes without the support of their heavy troops nothing could counter-attack Adrian shooters and cavalier, and began to run in until it reached ridge, and from there they were. It could not shoot on the main forces, and throwing, not to threaten them, drove the Persians in the mountains. Alexander just summed up its troops' copy the whole and threw them into the attack. The offensive began with his own cavalry strike from the right flank in the center, where Dori was standing and surrounded by his guards, surrounded by magnificent selected Persian cavalry, covered by numerous riflemen Immortal and Martha K. And these same cardo as hoplite by them Persian ordinary, armed Olia Greek hoplite. And, but far from the ledges, schemed them in. Alexander broke through at a gallop, simply jumped up to the stream, crossed it, and rushed forward with his guitars, scattering the Persian riflemen, and all these crowds breaking through directly to Tsar Darius. But his phalanx came up to the stream and also climbed to the assault. The most terrible slaughter did not boil here, because when advancing up the steep slopes of the stream on the right bank of the stream, the Macedonian battle formations were upset by individual taxis and their cohesion was lost. And the Greek hoplites immediately took advantage of this by rushing forward, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the Macedonians and mercilessly hitting the Hippocrates and Serisophors, long copies of which became useless. Almost the same thing the Romans would do in the Battle of Pydnum, much later Alexander. And the Persians were on to Macedonians, of course. I like the Romans, and here he writes about it. So the Macedonian army in the center was not so quick to step in. Soldiers often, when they found themselves in steep places, they could not keep a straight front line. A breakthrough formed, and the Ilyinsky mercenaries Daria rushed at the Macedonians, just where they saw their system most torn apart in this battle. Ptolemy, the son of Seleucus, and 160 more Macedonian hippos died, as well as a fairly large number of phalanxists. And for a while the situation in the center was extremely tense, especially if we will take into account that at the same moment, from the left flank, the Persian cavalry left the Charp and began recruiting for us the satrap from the upper, that is, the eastern Iranian satrapies, attacked Parmenion and Alexander, realizing in advance that it was there that the Persians would deliver their main blows, managed to hook his phalanx into the rear of this phalanx under the cover of the raised. We tried to transfer the Finnish cavalry from our right flank to help Parmenion, but even this was not enough. The Persians piled on, and the Macedonian, Thessalian horsemen could not oppose them. The battle was in favor of the PC, and at this moment, when the situation was so borderline, it was unknown what would happen in the future, including the defeat of the Persian army, which was primarily due to the fact that there were no disagreements between us in understanding what was happening. Ancient states and modern states are completely different structures. In ancient times, there were no centralized, unified states. What we have today, that we tell and wine and warriors of ancient times. When there's one Astana fort on the other is, and so like today, is mobilizing military district troops. I went to the soldiers fighting it because no modern centralized states just don't. There was management technologies were very primitive, and the empire was a collection of autonomous self-governing possessions of the territories, of communities, policies of cities, and so further, and tribes which came under the authority of the great king standing somewhere above them. High and far inner life preserved their old familiar often and devices, and lived in common with his own life therefore, under this system. And it had the same characteristic of Persia, and for a very primitive state of the device in Macedonia, where modern advanced was only the army. But by itself, the Macedonian kingdom was a replica of an ancient Greek would have the power. And there is such a tribal chieftain Mycenaean, another period of the Homeric period, and smaller than it is differed Greek Macedonia considered themselves to be the backwardness of the country policies. There was nothing, there was, and once there was not, departments of the ministries of industry, not centralized police, which is subordinate to the capital because nothing is in the sky. Even as the FSB at Raw, none of this did not exist, as power was exercised solely on the basis of voluntary recognition. Subjects of the supremacy of the supreme power of the king, and there would Macedonian power, and no matter what she was imposed by force of arms, but maintained that power by legend, myth, propaganda, all got the omnipotence of the winner, which this government did not knit all of these communities, tribes, people, and so on, and without this voluntary consent would not work. Neither mobilization, because the order came from the great king of communicating this, to put so many warriors, and if they refused, and, as they to repair the war against them, to arrange how long there is already Nikida comes from Macedonian countries, The same why Alexander was so worried about the expedition Bion in Greece, because suddenly the Greeks would have raised the revolt of the Greeks much more than the Macedonians. And the hoplites, they have a lot in common. It would be serious the threat Macedonian holding. And why all this was possible because, inside of him, preserve the autonomy of all these policies, city community unions. Are there any other italic different in the mountains, and the pianist and physical Elisk? And they all swore allegiance to the king, but also inside themselves for yourself, so that propaganda played a key role. In the ancient states, in all that in the government of Alexander I in the state on. And Dori tried to rely on the promotion of the Achaemenid propaganda of the Persian king of kings, fair defender, or a master Alexander, in turn. Waging war with Persia launched an extremely powerful the propaganda campaign of the war itself, was built based on the ideas of Panhellenism formulated to Philip E. and Socrates' Greek politicians, the unification of the Greeks to conquer the Persian monarchy, the superiority of the Greeks over the barbarians from Aristotle to Alexander hammered into his head that the Greeks clay as a cultural civilized barbarians are they do not know even people in. Whatever the case, these second-class citizens, and the first of these campaigns of Alexander, was a campaign under the slogan Revenge for the Persians invaded Greece. In the first second of the triumph of the ideas of Panhellenism in the whole of Asia Minor where the enslaved Greek cities on forests. He as Alexander brought the light of freedom Elias, but the culture naturally exemption from these barbaric Persian kings, and so we landing in Asia which taken with a spear. When this ceremony, he throws a spear at the beach, Asian jumps down to the beach as a conqueror, and the shield of Achilles, which he takes again. Here is the Trojan War, a new one begins. He is here as a new hill against the Trojans of the Persians, and the united Greek army is waging, and the proclamation of a panel from which the Union, which here also liberates the Greek Palaeus in Asia Minor, gives them a democratic structure, although in Greece, Alexander crushed the democrat. Purely such Greek propaganda. But as soon as he already deepens, there are no Greeks left in these Asian territories. And in general, Alexander didn't care about their ideas at the NSC, and as a pragmatic man, he understands perfectly well that he is being carried by these people, and he began to think about it when he was wintering in Phrygia. And this is the story of the Gordiad knot, in an extremely symptomatic way. She shows how Alexander begins to change his propaganda program, and he proclaims, instead of the ideas of Panhellenism, the idea of conquering Asia, divulging himself the king of Asia. I don't know if it was actually the cutting of the Gordian knot. Later, they came up with the idea because they love to create beautiful stories about their great conquerors, the kings. Can't get at the time. Troops combi for buried Chennai storm, and Alexander gets there, and his priests asked the son of the god Ammon, but to make busy was a pretty wild concept, knew that his father Philip, though Olympics persistent, told Alexander that he's actually the son of God, but relation to the Olympics Philip and Alexander is a special theme, and I can't without your own conclusions, do not insert. Though not the kind of antic that just believe that you are. There everything was so clear, as usual historians write, that Alexander kind of like a sissy. Turns out, I think on the contrary, that the Olympics was killed. Without the knowledge of Philip, Alexander never forgave her, so he is never in his mother was not seen, and gifts, and extruded, and the power, I know not given. And so are the Olympics. FGCU's quirks about the fact that Alexander is not the son of Philip, for he could not impress, but the fact that the priests did because it was to his advantage, as a political opportunist in politics, which had begun to look for a new basis of legitimacy for its authorities in Asia. For him, it was obviously a non-trivial task. Never been in Greek king obeyed such a huge Asian space. There's so many Asians, and if they will not voluntarily obey him, and he will control them. But there was then no centralized forms of administrative management. All power existed in the form of a sort of contract between the supreme power and to obey her communities, different kinds and method of the device. And without this consent, well, as if he rules that Asia, and then if he is the Son of God and is familiar Asians, then everything is fine. But as we'll see in Egypt superbly to work this concept, Alexander, because of the Greek Macedonian conquest of Egypt, will be the most successful for the rest of his previous story, how Pepper was studying Egypt, how many times Egypt rose for many decades, it was separated from the Persian monarchy, and the last the conquest of himself at all 6 story, and the third is literally on the eve of the Macedonian invasion and after Alexander the Great. There is almost no resistance of any. Well, will be then in Ptolemy's powerful, the revolt of Thebes. But it's after the battle of Raphia once Lima and equipped the Egyptians. And the Egyptians immediate back with you, used them with weapons to turn against the Greek invaders. But it's still even on the scale of any comparison with Egypt revolts against Persian Empire to compare. Therefore I must say that Alexander here, with a surprisingly ingenious policy flair, felt the same thread which, it turned out, the power and Macedonia, which even the Greeks not quite recognized in unlimited of the Lord of boundless Asian spaces, to believe all that was ahead of him when he gets back from Egypt and once again will face the king of the Tories, because of the 2 kings of Asia obviously could not be well, of course. Speaking of which, here is why Alexander did not accept offer Dori, and is the responsibility of the Persian Empire, and because he was so frantic that he was there then here Parmenian wise Alexander rabid. Such a thought often through this in the writings, of which even sort of on the side is Alexander, but not if you are already on disclosing himself king of Asia, that is, blame me. You must be 2 kings of Asia, cannot be, how can there be 2 suns in the sky, is a concept well known to any empire, which is always proclaims itself the only empire in the world. The Chinese Empire was the only, all other subordinates that Avila Empire and so on, but Alexander was from this same series. He hovered, that's fine, despite the fact that Macedonia was pretty archaic government politician. Alexander was a genius as much as he was a genius military commander. He did what no one before him didn't do in Greece, and with his usual authoritarian ruthlessly pursued its policy in life. And then we will see where it leads, and how the Greeks would displeased over the result. We get what is called Hellenism, when the Greek government political structure and culture to spread right up to the banks of the Ganges, when his descendants upon his successor in the career, and epigones therefore to say that the quality of the promoter of Alexander the course master and amazing. Why am I still here? You'll want here. On this note, we once again one face when it goes about Hannibal also be entered against Rome, propaganda war on an enormous scale, but he will be defeated. Alexander won the psychological war, so Alexander of always in antiquity was put in the first place, and even Hannibal himself took the role of the much lower than Alexander the Great. And well, today everyone, bye bye, see you on the channel, subscribe and so on and the like.